Okay, what we want to talk about today is accessing the knowledge and the methods of the entire treatment industry in order to facilitate resilience and improve outcomes. Think about it this way: we are renowned as an industry for when there's a threat, we circle the wagons and shoot each other. We are not necessarily known for our collaboration. Over these periods, we want to talk about this hour. We're going to focus on background, history, case studies, and outcomes.
5 degrees even.
And then,
It's very.
Judith, turn off. Oh, she's off. Techniques, methods, challenges, and solutions. And then the third part is goals, tasks, and actions. And in that session, we really want to help you focus on your own program and practice and the community you're working within, and see how you could use and perhaps expand your ability to collaborate and incorporate the various things that folks need. Again, this hour we're going to focus on background, history, case studies, and outcomes. We face global challenges. Some of you probably were, as we were in the Mr. Amsterdam's thing talk last night. And we have become very, very global. In the day and age we're living in, we know what happened halfway around the world, whether it's major or minor. A building collapsed in a little town in Italy, and I may know about it in Washington, D.C. This slide is a copy of a slide by because we want to look at what those various vulnerabilities are that are going on. This slide was used in Bangkok last year at the Therapeutic Communities, World Federation of Therapeutic Communities. Gilberto Guerra, who's the Chief Drug Prevention and Health Branch Officer of the United Nations Office on Drug Control, talked really about all of the changes that are occurring, the vulnerability factors, and the substances available for non-medical purposes, and the extensive nature of it. He also pointed out the change in the Asian regions from 2009 to 2017, the increasing meth demand in Orange, methamphetamine demand. I got to be honest and tell you that slide shook me, because it went from that he discussed and pointed out the fact that they went from heroin production to meth pill production, and that a lot of this is now crystal methamphetamine. This is again one of their reports, just looking at the sheer numbers of people that are involved and using various drugs. We're also dealing with mass trauma and being, again, intimately aware of mass trauma that is occurring all over the world. And just some of the pictures that are coming across our social media screens every day. Climate refugees. We know that the Earth's climate is changing at an unprecedented rate. And we know that the United Nations is estimating 200 million people displaced by climate change by 2050. And it could be our biggest refugee crisis. Every refugee and forced immigrant population has an average of 30% increase in addiction, mental health, heart, and lung issues. Every refugee community. We have epidemics, pandemics, yellow fever. And again, think about the fact that a number of years ago, we would not necessarily have been widely aware worldwide about these things going on. Random traumatic events. Daniele said, random unpredictable acts of violence are more terrifying and have greater immediate and long-term impact than violence in a community that is organized and at constant levels of preparedness, such as the Israelis and Palestinians.
How many of you, have either been in a war zone, in a in a situation of mass violence or unpredictable violence. Thanks, Bob. Yeah. It's a different world, and I think one of the things that that Gale is talking about is that this is prevalent around the world. There has always been unpredictable violence. There's always been war. Whether or not it really is vastly increased, or whether it's our media connectedness that has us much more aware, is a question. But it's something that every one of us, when we're dealing with clients, dealing with addiction, dealing with mental health challenges, is going to have to face.
And we do know, that there is secondary PTSD and such, so that, again, as Judith said, it's not either or, it's and. Mm-hmm. And we are so much more aware, and we are impacted by it.
Yeah, for every one person directly impacted by a traumatic event, within 10 years, another 5 have post-traumatic stress. So we're looking at an escalating, ever-increasing circles.
Another, basic fact that we're going to build on: physical or emotional abuse and neglect is a precursor to self-injury and suicide. Parents' childhood trauma, as Judith was saying, can influence their children's behavior, their substance abuse, their mental health, their view of life. Changing technology. Well, I already referenced that, but there it is. It's almost like you don't need to say anything else. This is, everything is coming at you, and, the hate, I hate you, all of those things. Kids and youth are spending 44 plus hours a week in front of digital screens. And we know that their brains and bodies aren't fully maturing, that they're not integrating the substances and behavioral compulsions can have a lifelong impact on brain and body. Substances and compulsive behavior before maturity can cause permanent abnormalities. And we also always have to keep in mind that the later the use or behavior starts, the less damage is caused, and the greater the ability to intervene. The sooner the use and behavior stops, the more opportunity for healing. Young people are vulnerable during transitions, and they are going through many transitions. Good transitions, difficult transitions. The nature of the transition, whether it's a positive transition, negatively perceived transition, it is the fact of transition and its impact on them. Dramatic transitions result in increased rates of stress, depression, and suicide, second leading cause of death for people aged 10 to 24, and relapse. We're dealing with so many issues and have access to so much information coming at us from every direction. Issues of gender dysphoria, eating disorders, gambling, gaming, love and sex compulsion, and whatever. Who knows what the next thing is necessarily going to be that impacts us. But we are being, in many ways, bombarded by all of these issues. It is the perfect storm. All of these factors threaten the fabric of families, and if families are at risk, youth and their communities are at risk. Perfect storm.
Okay, so one of the things that we'd like to do is really spend a little bit of time on our history to look at where are our roots, and as we think about them, how do we connect them so that we can take the best of all worlds, rather than ending up with dichotomies and competition and splits when there are not enough of us in the face of what's happening around the world. So really what we want to do is expand the capacity to recognize early warning signs, find hope in the face of despair, and we want to prevent the intergenerational legacy of disconnection and trauma, because disconnection and trauma are two of the key things that result in mental health, physical health, and addiction challenges. And we know that involvement of family, connectedness to family and culture are the key factors for preventing problems. And yet we're living in a time where there is incredible disconnection. We're dealing with global challenges as Gale went through them. So let's just look at some of the history for fun. Adolescents and young adults were even more at risk until the mid-1900s. That's pretty recent. Until that time, children were treated as small adults in every aspect of life. Awareness of separate developmental needs only started between the two great wars. And child guidance movement started in Britain from the end of the First World War. Until then, children were seen but not heard and regarded as really small slaves. Children's problems were attributed to maladjustment, and this view still prevails in some countries, and we're going to get into that a little bit more as we look at the family life cycle and individual development. We put this together just to have a quick overview of some of the key pieces. And one of the things that we find really interesting is that the battle between whether alcoholism and mental illness are a sin, a disease, or a crime goes back to a debate in the 5th century with Hippocrates, who was the first person to say that these were diseases, not bad behavior. The beginning of the battle between nature and nurture goes back to the 19th century, and the beginning of pre-1400s, demonology was the cause of mental illness, and the very beginning of an awareness of how to deal through community with addiction was in 1750 to early 1800s with the Native American alcoholic mutual aid societies, sobriety circles. So,
just to add,
yes,
because we've become big fans of Hippocrates and researching all of this, he was also the first to talk about nutrition and exercise in recovery.
Basically life skills, the things that we're now emphasizing. As we progress a little bit further, we look at the temperance societies. Dorothea Dix to get compassionate care for mentally ill, and Freud doing the first treatment of alcoholism with other drugs. He used cocaine to treat alcoholism. So the beginning of medically assisted treatment. This was the common view of mental illness in those days. Can you all see? Am I in your way? They were called lunatic asylums, and they tended to be out in the country, far away from where the inmates could damage anybody else. And typically people were locked up for life. And there are still, when Gale and I were teaching in Peru several years ago, there were still back wards in country villages in Peru where both people with mental health challenges and addiction were shackled to their beds for life and with no visitors, no connection with family. So this isn't quite as extinct as we would like. And then we go on to the late 1800s and the beginning of psychoanalysis. And Nellie Bly, who, following Dorothea Dix, posed as a mentally ill woman and documented everything that happened to her to try to change the way that people were treated. And just a little bit of a rogues gallery to show you the progression. And for some of us who are researchers, this was a major piece when Professor Wundt founded the first formal laboratory for psychological research in Leipzig. So if we move forward quickly to the key roots of our current models, we have the peer recovery model, which really started back with the Native Americans, but formally in the 1920s. We have the addiction treatment center model much later in the 1950s, growing largely from the roots that we've just gone through: analysis, medical treatment, psychological research, and the Maxwell Jones psychiatric therapeutic community. And what we have now and what we're strongly advocating is an integrative model where we're bridging the best of all of this, because a lot of the distinctions between treatment programs has disappeared over the years, where, and we're going to talk about that a great deal more, but the original Maxwell Jones model of psychiatric therapeutic community was primarily people with medical nursing, social work, occupational therapy, formal medical qualifications, where the therapeutic community growing out of peer recovery was people in recovery saying that the medical profession had no idea what addiction was really about, and that people needed to be in recovery to be able to provide effective treatment. And what we have now that's really interesting is in both the therapeutic community and in the modern addiction treatment center model, we have almost identical programming with a blend of people in recovery with or without degrees and people with degrees providing the treatment. So we're going to go into that a great deal more. But one of the things that worries me is that we're dealing with a vast number of people who are not getting the treatment they need for either mental health challenges or for addiction. In the United States, less than 5% of people who need treatment get it. And the bulk of those are in the, well, it's across the board, but particularly in the lower socioeconomic and challenged communities. And we really need to be putting together everything we know so that not just for our knowledge enhancement, but also to have a unified lobby instead of shooting each other in the foot, or feet, or however one's meant to say that. So now we get into our modern era, and we have the beginning of Alcoholics Anonymous, and following that, Synanon, which was the first addiction-focused therapeutic community. So that's the beginning of that therapeutic community movement, marking advocacy and care for mental health and addiction with the development of psychiatric facilities and a split in treatment models, which I think has been a tragedy that we really need to work at bridging at this point. In parallel, 1940s to 60s, we have Maxwell Jones in Great Britain with a sanctuary model of therapeutic community, which was originally in psychiatric facilities. As a psychiatric resident, that was the model that I was taught. We then have the establishment of drug-free therapeutic communities in Europe for heroin problems, and the TCs are now in more than 65 countries, and treatment centers are across the world as well. And following the early days of Freud with cocaine, we continue the movement of more and more medically assisted treatment, going right up to a new generation of prescription drugs for treatment and withdrawal from opiates and other drugs, and huge advances in psychiatric medicine. So we get to, I love this quote, "The thing that hath been is that which be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there's no new thing under the sun." Our clients may be best served by our humility and readiness to integrate that which is tried and true and proven to work across time as we develop and grow to address current challenges. I think our modern view of competition and division is really mitigating against our capacity to help our fellow human beings. And we have such vast problems to deal with. We need to partner, we need to work together. So what have we learned? We're looking at a blend of peer recovery, psychotherapy, analysis, psychiatry, neurology, spirituality and spiritual healing, traditional medicine, scientific medicine, adjunctive therapies, and how do we use these models as best they can be used, either independently or in combination? We have a vast array to choose from. So whatever our individual practice, I know and I love this conference because it truly is a cross-section of so many of us from different fields. Most of us consider the multifactorial nature of the challenges facing our youth and are ready to explore each level of the biopsychosocial, spiritual, cultural, environmental factors that our youth and families deal with. So Gale and I just put together a list of some of the things that we believe are key. Developmental history and life cycle, family and intergenerational developmental history, here including previous trauma and unresolved losses. We know that we see challenges in youth from trauma experienced by their great-great-grandparents. Individual, family, and intergenerational health and mental health history, relational history, particularly including attachment across generations, attachment and cutoffs with migration and forced migration, family and community resources, spiritual history and beliefs, culture, and the influence of transitions, including displacement, loss, and trauma, which have reverberating effects across generations. And family and community attitudes towards youth as positive or negative predictors. You think of things we've left out of here, please do tell us. We do not want to be teaching formally all morning, so do interrupt if needed. Can you think of things we might have left out of there? Because I'm sure there are. We're just trying to be, provide an overview. Good. Yes. And the influence of social and environment, social context, environmental, absolutely. Yes, yeah, absolutely. And our environment in terms of the geopolitical, our increasing earthquakes and tsunamis, and that the whole shift in social influences. Thank you. Okay, youth differ from adults in their response to transitions and stress. So we thought it would be useful to look at transition, and depending on cultural influences, our youth and their families and their communities and their social environments are either in or out of sync. So your observation was very timely. Thank you. Are you all familiar with the family life cycle and the fact that as individuals grow and change through their transitions, so do the families they live in? This is a depiction that grew out of Helm-Stierlen's idea that there are times in families where we are centripetal and times where we're centrifugal. So if we look at this as the child is growing, so then growing to be parents, and as the parents develop, so the child grows, and once the parents are grandparents, they're all developing in synchrony from childbirth to death. Which of these age groups and which of these phases are they most at risk of developing emotional, psychiatric, addiction problems? When they're together or apart? Yes, childhood, and particularly what part of childhood? Adolescence, yeah. So it's really if we think about addiction and mental health challenges, they tend to come in adolescence, reevaluation, and retirement. Those phases where we're more separate from our families. They also happen where there is untimely death, where the life spiral is reversed because a child dies unexpectedly and all of these phases of growth are no longer there. All the hopes and expectations of the parents, and the child goes from here straight through to death. So those sudden reversals of the life spiral are also a huge challenge. So as you might notice, this was done in 1985, long time ago. So what I did was look at, if that was the life spiral in 85, what does the life spiral look like now? And I was having some trouble because people were referring to children staying at home or not going straight into careers as having a failure to launch. Have you heard that term? And to me, it seemed just wrong to be calling what I see as a developmental stage a failure, because if we talk about failure with our patients, our clients, the minute we're called a failure, we start feeling bad about ourselves, and that increases whatever problems we have. So I looked at what's really going on, and we have an extra decade from modern medical science. Instead of going from childhood, childbirth to middle years, adolescence, and childbearing, we have a whole loop here. Childbirth, middle years of childhood, adolescence, late adolescence, young adulthood, coupling, childbearing with or without marriage. That decade is in here. So is this a failure on the part of our youth, or is it a failure on our part to adapt to a cultural social change? And how are we going to deal with it, rather than blaming the kids? And that same decade, settling down is no longer in the 40s. People have their second careers in the 50s. And retirement, even official retirement in a lot of places, has shifted from 65 to 75. But nobody is saying that the adults are failing to adapt. It's the kids that are being called a failure, right? So I think being aware that the demographic changes, the social changes, the cultural changes around us have a huge impact. And if you look at the population, we see that change across the population in terms of demography and numbers. So for us, as we work with individuals, youth, and families, we need to be aware of what is the context, where are they living, what's happening in terms of not just disasters and horrors, but what's happening in a day-to-day level of social change. So families can influence these outcomes.
Good of doing this. So we really do want to focus on the fact that all of these changes have occurred. We have an additional decade. We need to look at strength, not use the word failure to launch or whatever. And how can, it always amazes me that someone will come into, a clinician will come into me and say, this client is unworkable, this, that, or the other thing. And my first question to them is, what can we do differently? What can we do if your normal way of working isn't working for this client? What can we do differently? And that's extraordinarily important, I think, for all of us now. This is your connectedness study, so we may have changed a little fast.
Okay.
Although I can do it.
Thank you. Okay, so one of the things that I talked about earlier, you're right, one of the things I talked about earlier was the importance of our connectedness to culture and family. So one of my hypotheses was that we would take more risks, whether it was sexual risks, whether it was risks with addiction, even driving really fast and doing all sorts of hair-raising things like falling out of aeroplanes. So we looked at frequency of contact with extended family as a measure of connectedness to family. And we looked at which generation of family and so on, and how much contact. And then we looked at knowledge of family stories across time as a measure of connection to culture. And our first study was in a sexually transmitted disease clinic compared with women in a social community center. And the second was in a clinic for troubled adolescent girls. In both studies, the measures of frequency of contact and knowledge of family stories held up together and separately, and both correlated with sexual risk-taking. So the closer they were, the more connected to culture and the more connected to family, the less sexual risk-taking. We then, with the adolescent girls, analyzed the stories across time, family stories, for themes of resilience versus vulnerability. No surprise, the least risk-taking correlated with themes of resilience. The next lowest correlated with themes of vulnerability, and the most risk-taking correlated with knowing no stories at all. So we went back and looked at we analyzed the content of the stories to see what the differences were between the stories of resilience and vulnerability. And what really surprised us was that the stories were almost identical. The girls would talk about their family either having gone through murders, addiction, being refugees, really horror stories. And the difference was whether they said, my family is amazing, we have survived generations of horrible things, and I know if I do my work, I'm going to be okay. And the others would say, we've really been battered through time, and no matter what I do, I know that there's going to be addiction and depression and in generations to come. So what we realized was that we needed to enhance that sense of positive connectedness and help them draw on their family's inherent resilience, rather than labeling behavior and communication patterns as dysfunctional, which leads to continued vulnerability and risk-taking rather than increased self-esteem, competence, and self-efficacy. And we see the same importance of the brain with connectedness. Connectedness is interpreted as a reward by the brain and is associated with the release of dopamine. Conversely, brain imaging studies suggest that the same parts of the brain are activated during social rejection and physical pain. We're biopsychosocial, cultural, spiritual beings. It's all connected, and the better connected we are, the better the attachment from childhood on, but all the way back through the generations. It's not just the child and the nuclear or extended family here and now. It's all the way back. And for those of you who are interested, I did a TEDx talk looking at intergenerational connectedness. It's called Family Stories, Secrets, and Survival.
As Judith just said, when our brains interpret social isolation or rejection as pain. And adolescents, young adults, youth have traditionally been dealt with as problems to be fixed. The movement for positive youth development, which is a kind of an offshoot of positive psychology, focuses on their strengths and potential rather than their deficits, rejecting them as inevitable problems that need to be fixed, nurturing core internal strengths and abilities, providing opportunities for them to believe in themselves. I mean, one of the things I would tell you is in working with young people, the opportunity for them to understand that they have a seat at the table, that their opinions and their input is respected, doesn't have to be agreed with. Teaching that is so important to helping them understand that they have the ability to influence their lives and the world around them. And encouraging strength and positive development to ease a healthy transition into adulthood. I think one of the most important things we can do with young people who come to us is help them understand that they are strong, whole, and can be healthy, and that all they need is a toolbox to work with. Keys for adolescents and young adults. First of all, remember that they are a work in progress. Respect. Young people need to realize that they are full members of the family. Transparency. Always inviting a young person either to a family meeting or to a meeting about their treatment planning or what their needs are, what their school, social activities, etc. look like. Inviting them, respecting them. We need to be strength-based. Working with a young person, again, it is very easy for therapists to say, give you all the reason things are blowing up with a young person. When I'm working with supervising staff, the first thing that they have to give me when they want to discuss a young person is their strengths. What are their strengths? Because then we can deal with whatever problem comes up. We can figure this out together with them. Establishing boundaries. Young people do need to understand boundaries that are being set, be a part of planning those boundaries in order to learn what healthy boundaries look like. And we focus on their whole family system, understanding that when one person becomes symptomatic, the health of the entire family is impaired. And the young person is part of the solution for their whole family. Frequently, they are not healthy because someone in their family is symptomatic, or they have become symptomatic and the family system is struggling. Social connectedness, obviously with young people and with all of us, a sense of social connection is a basic human need. There's an interesting study on loneliness in America. In 1985, people reported that they had 3 close confidants that they would trust with their personal well-being. In 2004, it was 1. And 25% of respondents said they had no one that they felt they could turn to. Increase in loneliness, isolation, and alienation may be the leading reason people seek psychological counseling. That was one of the conclusions from that study. And think about the clients who are coming to you and the issues they're dealing with in terms of isolation, loneliness, and alienation. Lack of social connection leads to vulnerability, anxiety, depression, antisocial behavior, and suicidal ideation. Young people seek connectedness, but building and maintaining social connections requires a level of self-confidence and self-efficacy that many young people lack or feel they lack. So we've got a catch-22 situation here. So we want to shift their perspective, the family perspective. We believe that families and communities, and you heard this, families and communities are intrinsically healthy with both strengths and vulnerabilities. They are in constant transition, and they typically cope well until they're dealing with 3 or more transitions in a short space of time. Or those transitions are traumatic. I had the opportunity to go work in New Orleans after Katrina. And just the number of, obviously, all it needed was Katrina, but the number of transitions with homelessness, lack of food, lack of resources for periods of time were devastating. And just going in and being there as mental health professionals to assist was important and needed. The ability to access and utilize their strength and resilience unless they're cut off from their natural support systems. We would say that there are 5 keys to really helping families and young people, individuals. The first is to empower the family, the community, and the natural support system. We have to believe and trust that given the appropriate tools, they can ultimately help themselves. We need to reinforce the connection to family and culture of origin. We need to make sure that in empowering, that family and culture of origin are at the top of our agenda. We need to focus on individual, family, and community healing and recovery, and how that begins to look going beyond the individual client. So we know, for example, that an individual young person in treatment without their family being in treatment with them will unconsciously sabotage their recovery, whether it's mental health or substances or whatever. Remove the we-they dichotomy, being a part of a whole. Mobilize and reconnect the extended natural support system. Now, we all know that during times of trauma, frequently, when someone becomes has an individual symptomatic problem, they begin to disconnect. We just talked about connectedness and feeling that they had the lack of skills to develop that connectedness. What can families do? There's a whole lot of them. I'm just going to run through them. Share family meals, talk to one another regularly, take care of one another, take care of animals and garden together, share activities, worship, meditate, and grieve together. Share intergenerational family stories. Judith's study on connectedness always strikes me. What strikes me is it's not important whether the story is perceived as vulnerable or resilient. If you don't know your story, you are most at risk. So connecting those intergenerational stories is absolutely essential. Getting to know one another's friends, enjoying family celebration. Whoops, going to go. Those are where we have families. That is what the family can do. We're going to ask what other people can do. What can first responders do? Observe safety precautions at all times for self and others. Always work with a team. Debrief with a colleague or therapist on a regular basis. Provide education about prescribing and taking opiates. Be certified in CPR and administering naloxone. Whoops. First responders are key. We all know that. And the one thing we haven't said on here, we say work with a team, but self-care and understanding the importance for all of us of self-care and being able to talk through some of the things that we see and we hear. Then we look at what can educators do. We want to think of all of us as a team. We're a team. What can educators and consultants do? Understand the family life cycle. That is so key. Talking to educators, working with young people, as I do both in high school, middle school, high school, and college, understanding the separations that are going on. Colleges feel like they've become mental health institutions to some extent. And many kids have to be pulled out of college on medical leave because they just aren't ready to separate. Recognizing learning styles and challenges and making sure they share them with the other people who are working with this young person. Avoiding negative language. Really key. Supporting diversity and tolerance. Developing a robust referral network. Not clinicians, educators and consultants. Do motivational interviewing. So key, spending time working with educators on teaching motivational interviewing because it's not generally part of their curriculum. And meet with young people in their homes, collaborating with the family, and knowing where to refer and when to delegate. What can therapists, counselors, and treatment programs do? Communicate, connect, collaborate with families and other professionals, ensuring a continuum of care. No one of us or one program can possibly do everything. We need to collaborate and work together. Support family communication and connection. One of the things Judith and I talk about in some of the trainings is remembering the times when the idea of the best treatment for a young person was called a parentectomy. The parents were obviously the problem, so we got rid of them. That was probably one of the worst things we could do. Understanding that symptomatic behavior in members has its origins in love and protection. Life cycle transitions repeat themselves unless understood and resolved. Symptomatic behavior in family members has its origin in love and protection. Families, couples, group therapy, and psychoeducation, multifamily activities therapy, and identifying therapeutic modalities best suited to the individual client and their family. Teach positive ways of self-soothing. It's a toolbox. I'm going to go through these. Respect the natural hierarchy. Engage the entire system, being sensitive to cultural, gender, and spirituality issues. Identify patterns across generations and expose and resolve secrets. Assure continuity of family and community values, missions, and heritage. All of that are just the beginning of things we need to do, and the research shows that when we do it right, we get the results we'd like to see for our clients.
So, not going to do a lot about the research, but just some of the key pieces. And And then in our next section, we're going to go into a lot of the methods that, that we want to share with you. So some of the pieces just showing the importance of involving family and community. And what worries me is that we have a break between practice and research. And it's a frightening break to me because for those of us who are researchers, we spend our lives trying to look at what works, develop methods that hold up across populations, and then we watch the treaters practicing totally differently. And I'm not going to get on a soapbox, but it really scares me that there are still a whole slew of treatment programs around the world that don't involve families. And research shows that very few substance abusers enter treatment without pressure from their family and their friends. So regardless of whether there's a judge, whether there's a driving under the influence, the long-term entering and staying in treatment is dependent on our natural support system. Peer support is incredibly important. And one of the things that we know beyond a doubt is that...
Just not
thank you.
Because it's interfering.
Thank you. Thank you, Gale. I have a broken shoulder, and I tend to wave my arm around, which isn't good for it. So, very appreciative. We know that if we can get people to complete treatment, whatever that treatment is, their chance of long-term positive outcome is vastly increased. We also know that if we have the natural support system involved, it significantly improves not only the chance of treatment entry, but treatment completion. So, yes, please. Yes. I think it's expedience and money. And I also think that Gale mentioned parentectomy, which was what went on in the 1950s. And I think there is, I know there is still tremendous prejudice against families. When we do our RISE consulting to treatment facilities, we train everybody across the board, including the cooks, the gardeners, the engineers, and the drivers. I was driving to one of our facilities that we were about to consult to, and the driver was telling me how horrible the families are that he's driving to meet with the therapists. And as long as there's that, I think it's a natural thing. We become advocates for the people we work with. So if we're working with the families, we're advocates for the families, and we have, unfortunately, some family therapists who will say that this poor family, there's this rotten kid, who's really destroying the family, or it'll be the treatment program saying, this young person is doing so well in treatment, obviously the family is destructive, without understanding that one can't intervene in a part of a system. It's like taking a little cog out of an engine, changing it and putting it back in and expecting it to work the same way. It doesn't. We have to get both the individual and the family healthy if we want to bring about lasting change. Thank you for letting me say that. Absolutely, and the supervision and training, feeling competent. I think that's the other thing. It's not just the prejudice, it's the lack of, thank you, Bob, it's the lack of competence, that they're scared of working with families because of not being trained. Absolutely, and that's one of the things that unfortunately a lot of family therapy training programs do not do family of origin work with the family therapists. And if we don't really work with our own families, we have lacunae, we have things we don't see because of what we're not seeing ourselves or what our own trauma is that isn't resolved. Yeah. Thank you. We know that in terms of outcome studies, there's Stanton and Shadish did a meta-analysis in 2007 that Stanton updated in 2013, and they did meta-analyses. They took all the outcome studies of individual treatment, couples treatment, and family treatment for addiction. Individual treatment works up to a certain point. Couples treatment works better. Family treatment works exponentially better than either of the others. And family treatment very often includes combination and the best includes individual work, couples work, and family work, and collaboration across the board. We work best in teams. We help our patients and clients most when we work collaboratively. These are just some of the additional references that are really, really helpful. And it's the same with the mentally ill, with our co-occurring disorders, that we have to work collaboratively, we have to include families. Transitional family therapy was the first integrative family therapy model, this was one of the TFT studies. There's a chapter in the new Encyclopedia of Couples and Family Therapy, and TFT is the basis of all the modern integrative models. This was a group comparing transitional family therapy, 16 formal sessions compared with treatment as usual, done through the National Institutes on Alcohol and Alcohol Abuse in the United States. And it was compared with treatment as usual at 3 years. Both adolescent and family markers were significantly improved and continuing to improve at 3 years with the family model. Treatment as usual, both adolescent and family markers improved initially and returned close to baseline at the 3-year mark, which isn't a surprise. I mean, our youth continued to live in their families, and if the families weren't getting healthy and parallel, nothing changed. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration's national evaluation data show that children who experience trauma and receive treatment show significant improvements in behavioral and emotional health, improved school attendance, fewer problems at school, and at the 1-year mark, rates of suicidal thoughts reduced 68%, suicide attempts reduced 78%, externalizing behavior reduced 17, and symptoms 22. We do need to provide treatment, and we need to provide it in the context of family. I know. Okay. I'm watching. We're going to be about 5 minutes over our time, if that's okay, and we'll just take our 15-minute break from there. This was an assessment of therapeutic communities across 52 countries, and with the therapeutic community really includes social outcomes and cost effectiveness, not just the individual, and responds to vulnerable populations and also to family, social environment, and community, and considers religious diversity, which is really important. And aftercare includes social reintegration, which doesn't happen with a lot of the individual treatment programs. And just to give you an example of a couple of community interventions, this was an intervention across the whole of Argentina, but focused, the evaluation was only done in Buenos Aires province, population of 12 million. The focus was on violence, HIV, AIDS, and substance abuse prevention for the community. The links So working through, TFT works through family and community links to expand the capacity of the intervention. So the links were concerned community members working in collaboration, and within 2 years there was a 400% increase in young substance abusers being brought into treatment by their families. Follow up 15 years later, in one city of 2 million people, 37 of 43 community projects were still functioning. And what we loved is our philosophy is we tread lightly and leave no footprints. And the mayor in that city had only been mayor for 5 years and claimed complete credit for all the community programs, which is exactly what we want to achieve. This was post-war Kosovo. Focus was on improving services and treatment compliance of chronic mentally ill, reducing rates of addiction, and developing health and mental health services. There were only 37 healthcare providers left at the end of the war across the board, so everything had to be built from scratch. The links were professional and lay members of the community, and we established regional decentralized home health houses so that people would go to a health house, and only if the health house with a paraprofessional didn't meet their needs did they go to a clinic, and only if that didn't work did they go to a hospital. And they were not allowed to attend the clinic without a companion, a friend, a family member. And we mobilized family and community links in every region, ensured collaboration across the board, and within a year we had a compliance rate of individuals with schizophrenia and their families taking medication and attending treatment, compliance rate of 98%, which is unusual. Together we can work to integrate medical, scientific, and peer recovery methods all together to benefit and bring hope and healing to all. Our combined knowledge of the treatment industry and therapeutic community can help our children, adolescents, young adults, families, and communities facilitate resilience and improve outcomes. Okay, let's take 15 minutes and be back.